All right, so at this point in history, there's this increasing public awareness regarding the limits of our forest resources. By the late 1800s, the federal government starts to come up with some conservation measures to sort of rein in this mess, to try to get it under control. So the first step involved hiring Carl Schurz as Secretary of the Interior Department. He was a German immigrant, and as we'll get into a little bit later, the fundamentals of scientific forestry were really developed in Germany and throughout Western Europe. It's a country that was early to develop a systematic way to manage their forest resources in a sustainable manner. And so his first task really was to actually try to enforce this timber trespass law. The movement at the federal level to begin to implement some of these conservation measures was coupled with society in general, society's recognition that conservation was likely in our best interest, both socially and economically. Works of art and literature began to emerge addressing the impact a healthy environment has on the human spirit. So a great example of this is transcendentalist writer Henry David Thoreau. In his work Walden, really expressed the belief that nature is not, as once presumed, inherently bad or inherently evil. And he communicated quite eloquently his goals of becoming more self-reliant, socially aware, and further connected to the natural world by immersing himself in the wilderness and living in a cabin he built by hand. In his case, wilderness is really a relative term, as he's only really a couple miles from town. But nonetheless, his writing expressed a clear understanding that forest land and wilderness has importance to our society beyond the tangible resources that can be harvested from those areas. Another influential work of conservation literature that kind of came out of this time period was George Perkins Marsh's Man in Nature, written in 1864. Largely recognized as our nation's first literary environmentalist, he was the first to really connect the dots between a healthy environment and human survival. He drew comparisons between our society and some failed societies in the Mediterranean that actually collapsed as a result of poor land and soil management. So in these early Mediterranean societies, as trees were harvested in sort of an unplanned manner along steep slopes to make room for agricultural development, erosion resulted, eventually reducing the productivity capacity of the land to the extent that crops could no longer be grown, thus leading to the collapse of those societies. And so the primary question that Marsh poses in Man in Nature was whether we are of nature or above nature. Can we operate outside of the natural laws of the ecosystems we inhabit? And historical evidence of these based on historical evidence of these failed states, the answer is pretty clear that likely not for long. And so conservation activity was occurring at the state level as well. The Adirondack Forest Preserve was established in New York in 1885 to include both state-owned and privately owned, but state-regulated forest land. The preserve consists of over 6 million acres of land in upstate New York, and to put this in perspective, that amount of land is larger than Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, and Glacier National Parks combined. And so what's interesting is that the land was set aside by the state, and this huge conservation project was initiated for primarily economic reasons. Though the land, in my opinion, is as beautiful as any other area of the country, it was established first and foremost to control erosion and the sedimentation of the Erie Canal. The canal allows cargo ships to reach the Great Lakes from the Atlantic Ocean by way of the Hudson River, and it was at risk of becoming unusable as a result of erosion caused by the widespread liquidation harvesting of forest land within the Adirondack watershed. So to protect this major economic artery, the state took an unconventional step of protecting the forest land around it. While the nature of acceptable land use is still debated in the preserve, it's become a great example of an extensive area of forest land that's used for a variety of purposes, including timber production, while it still protects the ecological health of the area and, by extension, the economic health of the region. At the federal level, the Commission of Forestry was created in 1876 under the Sundry Civil Appropriations Bill, and this commission was charged with figuring out how to manage the forest land within the public domain. Franklin Huff was appointed to the job within the Department of Agriculture from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The commission was renamed the Division of Forestry, and German forester Bernard Furnau followed Huff as the chief in 1886. This is the agency that would eventually become the U.S. Forest Service, and would have to wrestle with the management of public forest land for years to come. The agency would also begin to clarify its role regarding the regulation of private forest land in the coming years. An important development regarding federal forest policy in the U.S. occurred in 1891 with the passage of the General Revision Act. And so this act is the one that actually gave the President authority to set aside forest reserves to keep land within the public domain that would be managed by the federal government in perpetuity. So these lands would form the base of the national forest system in the United States. There was still a question regarding how the federal government would manage or use these lands. Once land was reserved, what was the appropriate level of use? Should timber harvesting be permitted? Should all this land be set aside as a preserve? These questions would lead to serious debate, really serious, contentious debate at the turn of the 20th century. And so at this point in time, we really start to see a philosophical divide between those in the country who would have hoped to see full utilization of public land in the forms of timber harvesting and open grazing, and those who would have hoped to see all federal land preserved for its scenic and aesthetic and recreational value. The debate was further propelled by the establishment of Yellowstone National Park in 1872, our nation's first national park. USGS surveyor Ferdinand Hayden was dispatched to establish the potential value of the land as it was set to be sold at public auction. Basically, he reported back that the scenic beauty of the land far surpassed the value of the land in terms of economic development or direct resource extraction. So it was his opinion that this area, including parts of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, should be set aside as a recreational ground, right, for the benefit and enjoyment of people. So his opinion was supported by photographs and paintings of the area created by artists who were part of his expedition. Congress was convinced of its value as a cultural resource and withdrew it from public auction, and President Ulysses Grant signed its dedication into law. A major contributor to the public land use debate at the turn of the 20th century was Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot would eventually be appointed the chief of the U.S. Forest Service and is largely credited with importing the scientific methods of Western European forestry and applying those methods to the resource management concerns of our country. Ironically, the Pinchot family amassed, great wealth through land speculation and timber harvesting, and it was Gifford's father who suggested that he travel to Europe and study forestry as a means of introducing this practice to America. He initially studied at the French Institute of Forestry, traveled throughout Germany studying forestry techniques. Like his father, Gifford was wealthy and really politically connected. So following his study in Europe, he came back to the States with the intention of establishing forestry as a legitimate practice. He aimed to prove that timber can be harvested in an economic and sustainable manner through proper planning. He believed in the wise use of federal forest land as well as the federal regulation of private forest land use, which was, over time, would become a very contentious issue. So it was Gifford Pinchot's opinion that this federal forest land, this area of land that was set aside as reserve from the public domain, should be managed for the utilization, preservation, and renewal of forests, waters, lands, and minerals for the greatest good, for the greatest number, for the longest time. It was his contention that we should in fact use these natural resources, but we should do so in a well thought out scientific manner. Not only was Pinchot appointed the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service when he was established under Teddy Roosevelt, he also founded the Society of American Foresters, which is the professional organization that, among many other roles, develops the forestry curriculum for accredited forest technology programs in this country, like the one here at Haywood Community College or North Carolina State University. And, looking back, it's really easy to paint Pinchot as sort of this monster of utilitarianism, one who was really only concerned with the extractive value of forest land. But as we'll see in part 2 of this lecture, this was not exactly the case.